Hello artist friends, it's Sarah with Chromayati Fine Art, and today I'm going to be walking you through how to do a Dutch pour on a wood board. I love making these boards because they're both beautiful and functional. I first start by protecting the back of the board from any paint or resin drips. I used to tape the backs, but now I use liquid latex. It has saved me a ton of time and doesn't leave behind any tape residue. To use it, I just pour it on and spread it around using a paintbrush. This stuff will gum up your brush once it dries, even if you wash it. So I now have designated this brush as my latex brush. It usually dries within a few hours. You'll know it's dry when it looks clear. If you have an area that's still opaque and it's been a few hours, it's probably because you had too thick of a coat on it. It can still be fine to use though, as long as it's dry to the touch. Once you've confirmed it's dry, check the edges and just rub off any that may have dripped onto the edges of your board. Next, before painting, I also prep the front of my board. I use Scotch Original Blue tape to mark the edge of where the paint will go. I've also found electrical tape works as well for getting a good clean seal. Make sure you add extra side pieces of tape so you get a straight edge line. Then I cut a piece of brown craft paper and tape it to the front and back of the board. Lastly, I use a scraper tool to push the edges of the tape down. If you have a board with a lot of deep noticeable grain in it, I do recommend laying down a coat of either acrylic or spray paint first, and then letting that dry. This will help fill in those grooves so they don't show through your paint. You could also sand the wood. This board didn't have anything noticeable I wanted to cover up on it, so I'm just going to move on and lay down my base layer of paint. The base paint I'm using is Arteza Payne's Gray. All of my paint is mixed with a 3:1 Floetrol to paint ratio, and then thinned with water so it has a pretty runny consistency. The other colors I'm using are Crimson Red, Magenta, Champagne Gold, and White. After my base paint is down, I'm going to layer each of my colors in a wave shape. Then I blew out the design in opposite directions, trying to get the paint to spread out across the board. I then use a straw to blow out some of the edges. I personally think the trickiest part of doing a Dutch pour on these boards is getting the composition to feel right in such an odd shape. So I do usually play and alter them quite a bit, like this top part here. One technique I use a lot for altering pour art is adding a little bit of paint on a palette knife and then touching up an area I'm trying to adjust. After all that tweaking, I was pretty sure I wanted to add a little bit more paint in the left corner to balance out the design, but I wanted to see where the edge line was going to end up after it dried. So I let it dry for a couple of days and then removed the tape and paper. I then added more paint in each color and blew it out. This was such a small section that I used an airbrush tool to blow out the detail. One tip I have for blending in paint to an existing piece that's already dried is to make sure you blend out your edges. I used my finger and a paintbrush here to do this. That way the piece won't dry with a noticeable edge. I then tilted the board to give the blowout more of the shape I wanted. Once that part was done, I decided the middle needed just a little tweaking too. So I added more paint and used the airbrush here as well. Once I was happy with everything, I let it sit for a few days. Next, I add a couple of resin coats to my boards to protect them. I have had a few of you ask in the past if you can do varnish for this step instead, and the answer is yes, you can. Personally though, I like the durability that comes with using resin, and of course the shine and glass-like finish as well. Before I add the resin coat, I once again lay down tape along the edge of the design for protection. I then lay a layer of plastic wrap down too. The plastic wrap does a better job than the paper for this part since the resin won't absorb into the plastic wrap. For all of my resin projects, I use Extreme Resin. They do not sponsor me, it's just the most affordable, easy to use resin I've found. First things first, please make sure when using resin you use it in a safe, well-ventilated area. Make sure you also put on rubber gloves and a mask. This resin is a 1-to-1 ratio, so you need to mix equal parts of the resin and the hardener. For a board this size, you need about 3 ounces of resin. I'm mixing more than that here because I covered some other pieces after I coated this one. Then I stir it for 4 minutes. Make sure you scrape the sides and the bottom often as you stir. You'll see lots of bubbles once you're done, but you shouldn't see any opaque looking streaks throughout the resin. Then you're just going to pour it on and spread it around. Make sure you really get the edges of the board covered good. And then just hit it with a blowtorch to pop any bubbles. Then I cover it with an Amazon box and let it sit for 3.5 to 4 hours. After that time frame, you want to remove the tape so the resin doesn't have any harsh edge to it. This time frame may vary depending on the brand resin you use, so what you are really looking for is the resin to be tacky but not runny. This will also give you a chance to wipe off any resin that may have sneaked through your tape and onto your board before it's cured. So after I've removed the tape, I just put the box back on top and let it finish curing. Because of the large rounded edges, I find that most boards need 2 to 3 coats of resin to get a nice smooth finish. So I just repeat these steps until I'm happy with the finish. Once it's finished, to remove the backing, you just heat it up in small sections at a time with a heat gun. You want to make sure you don't overheat these areas though, or the resin will tear. I really like the heat gun I'm using here because it has temperature controls on it, so I make sure I don't overdo it. It and all the supplies I used here will be down in the description of this video. Then I use an X-Acto knife to trim along the edge, which will allow your resin to tear off in a nice clean line. After I've trimmed along the edge, everything will just peel up and you get a nice perfect back. If you do end up with any sharp or uneven edges, I use a small nail grinder to sand them down. And this is the finished board. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and feel free to ask any questions in the comments below. And as always, happy painting!